You know, every Monday morning, the alarm clock goes off. You are sound asleep in bed, warm, cozy, especially on a cold morning. The alarm goes off and you don't want to get up because, well, you're comfortable. And really, if it were up to you, you would just stay put. And yet, you do get up. Why? Because it's time. It's time to get moving. It's time to get ready. It's time to get to work. Have you ever considered that even with all of our moaning and groaning about having to go to work on Monday, there's something special about the ability to do that? When we open up Scripture, we find in Genesis chapter 2 that God created Adam and He made him to work the garden. He put him to work. Tells me that the ability to move and act, to work, is not a curse, but it is a gift from God. It's something was given to us before the fall of man. There's something special about the ability to get up and get moving. It energizes the body. It refreshes the mind. It brings purpose to what we do day in and day out. Furthermore, when you open up Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, we are told that we are God's workmanship, His masterpiece that has been created for the purpose of doing good works. What does that have to do with being in the haze of life right now? When suffering and confusion take place, oftentimes, we become paralyzed by the situation around us, figuring out where are we going to go, what are we going to do, and we wind up doing nothing. But even after the period of assessment, even after the period of just getting your bearings, somewhere along the way, we have to say, it's time. It's time to move. It's time to do something about where I am and what I'm doing. Because if we don't, we will just go deeper and deeper into the despair that we feel. Join us today as Brett challenges us now to realize that it's time. It is time to do something about our situation through the haze.
Welcome to my garage workshop, where I've been out here for countless hours at times, or in other garage workshops where I've done about 3 home remodels. It's something I enjoy doing. I enjoy the success that comes from doing some of my own work and not having to hire a professional. There's been a lot of times to where I've had a massive problem in the home and I get quoted, $1,000, a couple $1,000 to do the project, and I thought, well, I can learn the skill myself and buy the tools for cheaper than it would cost for a professional. And so it's something I've enjoyed doing. Over time, there's been a lot of problems that I've encountered. When you open up walls, you never know what you're going to find. There was one particular time on the first home remodel that I ever did, in which I had a light switch that was flickering. The light would flicker whenever you would move the light switch, or even just at random times. Something was not right with the electrical. And so when I went up and investigated, I found out that there was a box that was hidden inside of the wall, which is illegal. It's against code. Well, I made a hole in the wall. I gained access to that box, and I found that what had happened is whoever originally did the house had taken the wires, had brought them together, and then just put electrical tape around them, which is a big no-no. Not only that, but it was inside a metal box, and it was stuffed with old newspaper from the 80s. And so not only was it shorting out, it was flickering, causing sparks within the box with newspaper inside of a metal box. That thing was a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the right circumstances to set my house on fire. Thankfully, we were able to get it corrected. We were able to, avert disaster. But I've enjoyed being able to do some of this work myself. There have been a lot of times in which I have felt overwhelmed with the amount of work that's been needed in my home. from baseboards to electrical to plumbing to structural things that needed to be fixed. It can feel very overwhelming when it feels daunting to see the massive amount of work that needs to be done within a home. And yet, you kind of come down to a point to where you have an option. You can kind of wallow in your despair and be stressed out with the amount of work that needs to be done, or you can just get to work. As we've been going through this series together, we've been trying to navigate through the haze, through the difficulties that we may be facing in these last 6 months or so. It's been challenging. It's been difficult. But there comes a time when we have to move outside of feeling overwhelmed and feeling paralyzed by everything that's been going on. And where it's time to move. It's time to act. It's time to do something about the way that we've been feeling. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today. It's time. It's time for action. When we take a step back and we look at some of the people that have been going through difficulties that we've been discussing in this class, there's actually been a common thread or a common theme that we've seen that has helped bring them out of their difficulties. And that was action. I want to look at 4 different action words that are associated with these people on how they were able to move forward and achieve greater success in their life. At some point, what we may need to do first of all is just move. I think about Hagar and how she had been having so many conflicts with Sarah, and it had reached a point to where she was sent on her way. So she took her son Ishmael and went off and just became so overwhelmed with her despair, and eventually went out kind of into a wilderness area. All she had was a water skin, and she sat her boy down underneath a tree, and then it says that she went about a bow shot away and just requested that she would die. And she wanted to be that far away because she didn't want to hear her boy cry, because she had essentially accepted that they were going to die. And yet what happened when God answered her is something that's very interesting. When we took a look at Genesis chapter 21, starting in verse 17, it says, God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. And so what God told Hagar to do in the midst of her difficulties is arise, get up, move. Stop wallowing in your despair. It's time to get up, and it's time to do something about this situation. It's interesting that that's what God asks a person to do who has been dealing with difficulty. But I also think about what God told Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. If you remember, Elijah had gone off into the wilderness, and he sat down underneath a juniper tree, and he just requested that he would die. And as he went to sleep and was just overcome with the despair and the depression of his circumstances, here's what God told him to do in verse 7. The angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. And so he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And so we see a common theme here. We have people that are just overcome with their despair, and the first word that's communicated is arise. Get up. It's time to take care of ourselves. It's time to eat something. It's time to stop wallowing in the despair, and it's time to get to work. It's time to get to action. In other words, it's time to move. I don't know how we've been feeling during COVID, but certainly one of the common themes is if we've been kind of wallowing in our despair and been overcome with the situation, one of the best cures is to move. to get up, to start doing something about this, taking care of ourselves, and driving ourselves towards a solution, instead of just remaining with all of the pressure of the situation. It can feel so overwhelming. The circumstances of COVID, to the difficulty with jobs, to the stress that is put on the family and our kids, not to mention the election that is coming up. There are countless things that are happening in life today that can make it feel so overwhelming. But until we get up, we start moving and trying to do something to improve our situation, it'll remain the same or even just get worse as that pressure continues to build within us. It's time to move. I think about a story that was told about an accomplished architect by the name of Frank Lloyd Wright. He had built a house for an accomplished businessman, Hibbert Johnson, back in 1937. And Frank Wright was known for just having superior work and design. But there was a particular rainy evening in which Johnson was entertaining some guests in his home, and a leak started in his house, and of all the places in which the water could drip, it began to drip right on top of his head. And so, furious and embarrassed by the situation, he called up Wright, and he told him about how not only was the roof leaking, but it was leaking right on top of his head. And Frank Wright simply replied, "Well, Hib, why don't you move your chair?" Obviously, the situation needed to be fixed, and it was something that Wright was going to have to deal with. But it didn't help that Hibbert Johnson was remaining in the same spot and allowing it to drip on his head. To help improve his circumstances, at least in a small way, he needed to move his chair, move his situation, change his circumstances for the better. It doesn't do us any good to remain as we are, wallowing in our despair. There comes a time when we need to move. So whatever it is that we've been dealing with, whatever pressures that we've been having in our situation, now is the time to move, to do something about it, to change our circumstances, even if it's small, even if it's in a seemingly insignificant way. Those small changes over time can help to improve us. And so maybe some of the moves that we could make is changing up our routine. Moving our routine to reflect something that is going to be more spiritual. Or perhaps changing up our routine, moving our routine in which, and if we're working at home, maybe we get dressed for the day. Having a sense of being put together, and there's actually been studies that have shown that it actually has a psychological impact on us when we get dressed and we get ready, even if we're remaining at home. Maybe it's just time to move, to change our circumstances so that we can better manage through this difficult time. Not only should we move, but we should act, which is our second word that I'd like to talk about today. When you think about people that were successful in the midst of their difficulties, a common theme is they acted upon their circumstances. They went into action and didn't just remain paralyzed or remain in the same situations in which they were in. You think about how many times Joseph encountered difficulties in his life. From being thrown into a pit and sold off into slavery. And yet, what did Joseph do? We're never told that there was even a moment that he remained kind of wallowing in his misery. He certainly could have. But after he was sold into Egypt, what did he do? It says that the Lord was with him, and he began increasing and being very accomplished and successful in his life. Because it doesn't ever seem like he had a moment, at least that we're told, in which he kind of wallowed. He began changing his circumstances, acting upon what he could control. And so he began increasing in the land of Egypt until he became even the number 2 guy. Well, then he had that additional circumstance in which Potiphar's wife began making advances at him. and it ended up landing him in prison. Again, we're never told that he wallowed in his misery or the unfortunate situations that were coming to his plate. What he did was he began increasing even within the jail. And of course, eventually got himself out of prison and improved his circumstances. He acted upon what he could control in his situation. Or what about Ruth? Of course, Ruth and Naomi went through untold difficulty, incredible difficulty, in which Ruth loses her husband. He dies. And Ruth and Naomi end up moving back, and one of the things that Ruth asks Naomi is, I'd like to go and try to glean what I can from the fields. She showed herself to be a hard worker, where she was actually gathering a fairly large amount that would have taken her all day, and she did that every day. Well, that caught the eye of Boaz. And then she began very subtly showing an interest in Boaz, which was eventually going to form into a relationship and then into a marriage, and it would improve her circumstances greatly. There was a lot of things that were out of Ruth's control, but she did what she could. She acted upon what was in her control, and it, of course, turned her situation into something beautiful. What comes to mind in a situation like this is that of a oyster. I don't know if you know how pearls are made, but it starts when a rock makes its way inside of the oyster. And an incredible process begins in which, in order to deal with that irritation and to protect itself from further damage, the oyster will begin surrounding it with a substance that, after many layers, becomes what we know as a pearl. The oyster is a prime example of controlling what it can, dealing with the difficulty in the way that it can, and turning something that is a problem, something that is a difficulty, and making it into something beautiful. We have an opportunity right now, in times that we have never known, we've never seen anything like this. Even if we think back to what had happened with the incoming of the flu virus, there's so much about this that is different. But this is an opportunity for us to think outside the box, to control and to impact what we can, to change what we can, and improve our situations. There could be many actions that we could take to improve our own personal relationship with God. That's within our control. There can be some opportunities in which we might be able to reach our neighbors who are home more, perhaps, to be, and perhaps save a soul. Let's focus on controlling what we can, because it's time to stop wallowing, but to act. The third word that I'd like to focus on is the word reach. It's time to reach out, to reach up, to reach in, to change our circumstances for the better. When I think about what occurred with Moses in Exodus chapter 18, he began feeling extremely overwhelmed from the pressure of the people, and he was shouldering it all himself. He was taking all of the difficulty and the challenges of the situation, and he was placing it on his own shoulders. And his father-in-law Jethro came to him and gave him some very good advice. It says in Exodus 18, starting in verse 17, Moses, his father-in-law, said to him, "The thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." And so what Moses does is he begins appointing other leaders to help share the burdens and to help people with the disputes and to help spread out the load that he was carrying. We are in a prime time right now in which we may be shouldering a pretty great load. Why don't we just reach for help? Again, that something that we had discussed is a lot of times we almost view it as a weakness to say, man, I'm having trouble with this. And instead of just reaching out for help, reaching out for somebody that can help share the burden and carry the load with us, we try to do it alone. And in the words of Jethro, the thing in which we are doing is not good. This is the point of the church. To help each other, to share burdens, to be strong for the other person, or let them be strong for us, to help spread out the load of the burdens that we may be facing. Now is the time to reach. There's at least a few directions that we can reach. The first is that we can reach out to God. There was a preacher back in the 1800s who was feeling extremely stressed out and loaded down with the burdens of his ministry, the pressures that he was facing. Well, one day he came home and he was greeted by his young daughter. But his daughter was paralyzed. He was about to be carrying a package that he had gotten from the mail upstairs when his daughter said, "Daddy, I'll carry that package for you upstairs." And he said, "Dear, I appreciate that, but how are you supposed to carry the package?" And with a smile on her face, she said, "I'll carry the package, and then you can carry me." This sweet gesture from the daughter reminded him kind of the way that God wants to help us with our burdens. We a lot of times have a load that we're trying to carry that is just impossible for us. Comparatively to God, we're paralyzed, we're disabled. And yet, as we hold our burdens, not only does He help carry our burdens, but He carries us. If we would but reach out to Him for help and let Him carry us through the circumstances that we're going through. Have we reached out to God? Have we reached up? But let's not also forget that we can reach out to others. Back in 2011, I had an unfortunate circumstance happen to me in which I blew out my knee. If you're not familiar with the term of blowing out a knee, what it means is that you have ruptured your ACL, you've torn your MCL, and typically your lateral meniscus. As I was playing basketball, there was a guy that went on a breakaway, and I was trying to sprint back in order to not give him an easy basket. As I began kind of catching up to him, he stopped to go around me, and I planted and pop, felt it in my knee. And what was interesting on what occurred in my body was how everything began responding together. As soon as I realized that there was something wrong, before I had even hit the ground, I felt the pop and adrenaline began rushing through my body, and everything started happening in slow motion. As I was falling to the ground, I thought, did I just rupture my ACL? Maybe it isn't that bad. Maybe it was just something small. As I continued to fall, my hands began reaching out in front of me to help brace for the fall. And my entire body began working together to take pressure off of my knee and to turn myself so that I could be in a seated position. Then all of the pain receptors began firing, the nerves throughout my body to tell me that something is hurting. And my body instantly began throwing out endorphins and to begin sending painkillers to the knee, realizing that there was something wrong. My arms and my legs began reaching to my knee to help support it. My face began grimacing as the pain set in. When I had a moment, I began using my body to scoot myself off of the court in order to try to get out of play and out of danger of the rest of the game. My eyes began scanning over my knee to see if there was swelling or if there was discoloration. And it was interesting how my entire body responded to the pain of the knee. This is exactly the way that the church should respond when somebody is going through something difficult. Is that when somebody is hurting, we all begin rallying around that person to help carry the burden, to help aiding with the pain and difficulty that's occurring. What I find interesting is that even the parts of my body that could not help with the knee were still responding. Like my face grimacing or my eyes checking over the knee, they weren't really helping the situation. And yet what they were doing is weeping almost with the pain of my body. The concept of the body working together, of course, is extremely common in Scripture, from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 12 through 26, or Romans chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, or even the idea of Christ being head of the body in 1 Corinthians 11, 13. Yet sometimes as individual parts, we forget that we're part of the same body. It may be time to reach out to other parts of the body, or for other parts of the body to be watchful, or to be listening, or to be looking and helping, reaching for other parts that are going through something difficult or may need help. Let's work together as a body. Or, if we're hurting, let's reach out for help. Finally, the last word that I'd like to talk about when we're talking about action and moving is change. I think about what occurred with Jonah in Jonah chapter 4. If you remember, he had been told by God to go to Nineveh, and he didn't want to, and he ran from God, which of course is impossible. And God ended up directing him towards Nineveh. But what I find interesting is after he preaches what is essentially the world's shortest sermon, where he tells them to repent, and they do, he gets very upset and very angry with that situation. It says in Jonah chapter 4, 3 and 4, "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." The Lord said, "Do you have good reason to be angry?" In other words, he is upset with the situation. He's almost upset that people repented. And God is saying, it's time for a change. Do you realize why you're even angry? And as the chapter continues to unfold, there is a plant that exists that gives Jonah some shade, and he finds some comfort sitting in the cool of the shade of that tree. And then God appoints a worm to come and to damage the tree enough to where it shrivels up and dies within just the next night. And he wakes up, and it's now hot, and the tree, the little shrub is gone, and he becomes angry once again, and God gives him another lesson about how his perspective needed to change. It may very well be that as we have continued to look at our circumstances, to be upset with the difficulties and everything that's happening around us, it may be time to change our mindset, to change our perspective, to stop focusing on everything that has been against us and start looking at what can be for us. To stop focusing so much on what has been taken away instead of what now can be gained. If we will change our perspective, we will see that there's opportunity. If we'll change our perspective, we'll see that this is a moment for growth. If we'll change our perspective, we'll see that this can become perhaps a very beneficial time, even though it's hard. As we've been looking at all of the circumstances that have been happening, and as we've been going through each lesson in this class, as we've looked at all of the people that have had to shoulder difficulties, they all have a common theme: to bring themselves out of the difficulty, they had to get into action, which is what I want to encourage us to do. It's time for us to move. It's time for us to act. It's time for us to reach. And it's time for us to change.
You know, Brett, you and I, we chuckle about this being the moment of the obligatory thanks. You know, thanks for doing what you did. But I really mean it. This is a great, challenging lesson that you have laid out. It's a difficult one in the midst of suffering, but to realize that there comes a point where you have to start moving, you have to act, you have to reach out, and you even have to change. It doesn't do a lot of good to complain about the situation when you could readjust something yourself. So in all seriousness, I am very grateful to you for bringing out this conversation tonight over this topic. One of the things that I realize, though, is when you start offering this kind of a challenge and you start calling for action, inevitably there will be those who say, okay, well, tell me how What should I be doing? So to that, with that thought in mind, can you give us a little bit of an idea? What is something very practical, simple and doable that can be put into action pretty quickly along the lines of these 4 action words tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. And that has to be where we go with this, because if there's not specifics given, then how are people supposed to know what to do and what to change and how to move forward? And so I've tried to be as thorough as I possibly can. And so I'm actually going to be providing a list of 102 ways that you can put your current circumstances into some sort of action or some sort of thought. And so be looking for that link or that PDF file of 102 things that you could do to move, to act, to change, to try to do something different. But I also want to point back to something that we did near the beginning of COVID, which was our 40 Days of Power articles. If you will remember, we had 40 days of articles in which were done in the midst of quarantine, and we called for people to reflect on some sort of deep spiritual topic or reflect on their own lives. And we also provided an action that people could do. Everything from study to evangelism to service. And it might be a very opportune time to go back over those 40 days of power and just look for some additional actions that we can take to bring ourselves out of the haze, to bring ourselves just to a better state, feeling better, doing more as we're just trying to navigate through all of this.
You know, one of the things that I would add in all of this, a couple of points that come to mind. When we start calling for action, whether it's in this venue where 2 ministers are calling people to action, or whether it's even just self-reflection and we realize something needs to be done, there are a couple of things that I think get in the way that oftentimes will stop us from taking action. One is just simply the paralysis by analysis. You think about it so long that you never actually take a step. It's almost like I've been on several hikes since I've come, and when I look at some of these mountains I want to go climb, I pull up the map and I'm going, wow, there's 10 different trails to take. Which trail do I take? And I can look at them and look at them and look at them. I can ask the questions, which one's going to give me the best view, which one is more appropriate to my physical strengths at this point in time. And the thing is I can look at it over and over and over, but at some point I have to just take a step on that mountain and not worry about whether or not it was the best trail for me to take or if it was the perfect view. You can readjust along the way. So what I would suggest and have us consider is that as we are figuring out what actions to take in this haze, we can second guess everything. We can point back and say, well, this should have been done differently all along, or I should have been doing this at this point, or what if I fail at this one? Don't worry about that. The other thing that gets in the way, and this is also a little bit of analysis, but a lot of times we think to ourselves, well, it won't be big enough. I want to do, but I want to do big, and so I want to be able to help everybody involved. I heard a line on a podcast recently that addressed this very fact, and a lot of times this happens with people. We want to help, but we can't help everybody, and so we spend all this time trying to figure out how to help everybody. And the guy on the podcast said, hey, what you need to do, you need to do for someone what you wish you could do for everyone. And it will make a difference for them.
I've also heard an illustration in which a man was trying to find something big that he could do, and he was talking to a preacher, and he told the preacher, well, I'm going to climb the highest mountain that I can find. And when I get to the top, I'm going to proclaim the 10 Commandments from the peak of the mountain. And the preacher said, why don't you just stay here and do them?
Yeah.
And so we don't always have to do something big. We can do something where we're getting started. Just doing something, like you said.
Yeah. So the point in the grand scheme is that we need to get to work. We need to do something, because the more we move, the more we get, the more we put these actions into place, the sooner we're going to be able to come out of this haze. This doesn't mean it will be easy. Doesn't mean that you will have all the answers or that you will always choose the best action to take. or the most perfect action to take. But we need to do something, because the sooner we get moving, the sooner it's going to revive our souls, energize our bodies and our minds to get out of this haze, to get through all of this that we're dealing with for however much longer it goes on. Well, that's what we have for today. We are so grateful to you for joining us again. Next week will be our final lesson in this series, and we hope that you will come and join us as we close out what we feel like has been a challenging series for us. We hope has been a very blessing. We hope has been a series of blessing for you, and we look forward to seeing you as we finish out our study through the haze.